Good afternoon and welcome to a webinar on gender pay gap reporting in the education sector. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Jisha Hales and I'm joined today by my colleague Edward Donkor. We are both from the Government Equalities Office and work on gender pay gap reporting for the public sector. This webinar is aimed at employers in the education sector, including colleges and universities and schools, including large maintained schools and academy trusts. We fully appreciate that you may be at different stages in terms of awareness and the practical stages of producing your gender pay gap data. However, we hope that over the course of the next hour, we can provide helpful information on the reporting requirements and ideas on how you can tackle the gender pay gap. First up, Edward and I will talk you through a bit of the background, explain the reporting requirements, and then go through the possible ways to tackle the gender pay gap in your organisation. We will then have a question and answer session. Please feel free to submit questions via the online platform throughout the duration of the webinar, and we will try our best to answer as many as possible during the session. If we are not able to answer your question during the event, we will get back to you as soon as we can. So what is the current gender pay gap in the UK? Women working full-time in the UK are, on average, paid 9.1% less than men. This is the lowest figure on record, so we're making good progress. But disappointingly, the gender pay gap for all employers in the UK increased by 0.2% last year, and it currently stands at 18.4%. So we clearly need to do more.
So, how does this compare to the education sector? According to figures by the Office for National Statistics, there is an overall gender pay gap of around 26% in the education sector, which is higher than the average for the UK. I should say that this is not a direct comparison to the gender pay gap figure for the UK, as it only covers England, Scotland and Wales. But as you can tell, it is still higher than the national average. It is also worth noting that this figure covers the public sector and not-for-profit organisations in education, but excludes private sector organisations. Breaking this down further by category, there is around a 25% gender pay gap in primary education, a 24% gap in secondary education, 16% in further education, and 15% in higher education. So there are different rates of progress across the different sectors in education. Equal pay versus gender pay gap. I'm sure you're aware there's been a lot of coverage on the gender pay gap during the last few years, but frustratingly, the gender pay gap is often confused with equal pay. Equal pay, pay discrimination, and the size of employers' gender pay gap are quite different things, and it is important to note that the information that will be published by itself will not enable an individual to bring a claim. Reporting your data under the gender pay gap regulations will improve transparency about the average pay gap, not individual unequal pay. Just to be clear, equal pay is about men and women who carry out the same work, similar work, or work of equal value being paid the same. The gender pay gap, on the other hand, is a measure of the average difference in hourly earnings between men and women in an organisation.
So why is this important? As the first two stats on slide 5 show, women tend to take more time out to the labour market to care for children. This can have a negative impact on their participation in the labour market and the wages they earn over their lifetime. Research by the McKinsey Global Institute found that bridging the gender gap at work could add 150 billion to our gross domestic product by 2025. Addressing the gender pay gap will also help organisations to recruit and retain staff, which can be a particular challenge in the education sector. So moving on to the regulations. We introduced 2 sets of regulations last year to bring the mandatory reporting requirements into place for large employers. The Specific Duties and Public Authorities Regulations came into force in March 2017. It applies to large public bodies in England and non-devolved authorities. The organisations that need to follow these regulations are listed or defined at Schedule 2. Public bodies in Scotland and Wales are covered by separate devolved regulations. And broadly speaking, all other large employers in England, Scotland and Wales are covered by the Gender Pay Gap Information Regulations. It is important to note, though, that both sets of regulations require employers to carry out the same set of calculations.
So now we'll look at the reporting requirements for schools. There are a few things to bear in mind on how the regulations apply to different types of schools, which we have set out in slide 7. For academy trusts and free schools, it is the trust that needs to follow the regulations which apply to the public sector. Multi-academy trusts are of course a single legal entity and employer, so we'll need to report all of the academies in that chain. For maintained schools, it is the governing body who needs to report on the data for that school. Local authorities will not include any data on staff in maintained schools in their gender pay gap calculations, except for pupil referral units. And as a side note, independent and private schools need to follow the Gender Pay Gap Information Regulations if they have more than 250 employees. Again, it is important to note that the same set of calculations will be required. So we'll have a look at the reporting requirements for further education and higher education institutions. Slide 8 captures in technical terms the types of further and higher education bodies covered by the public sector regulations. Essentially, the relevant definitions are at section 91 of the Further and Higher Education Act 1992. This includes institutions conducted by further or higher education corporations and most universities in England and sixth form colleges.
Okay, so now I'm going to quickly run through the calculations that you need to prepare. Firstly, the mean and the median gender pay gap calculations. The mean gender pay gap reflects an employer's full earning range. The median gender pay gap is the best representation of the typical difference in earnings because it represents the midpoint in the pay range and it is not affected by a small number of very high earners. It's important to note also that we tend to use the median average for comparisons. Secondly, the mean and median gender bonus gap. Also, the proportions of male and female employees that received a bonus, and this information will show whether bonuses are being allocated fairly across your organisation. And lastly, the proportions of men and women working in each pay quartile. This can show if there are blockages to women's upwards progression within an organisation. Also, it's important to note that you must publish these figures on the government online reporting service and on your own website. We would strongly recommend registering as soon as possible with the online reporting service if you haven't already done so, in case there are any technical difficulties with registration, but also because you will be able to access additional support and sign up to our newsletter for employers. As we set out before, the gender pay gap shows a difference between the average earnings of all the men and all the women within a workforce. You need to use the average hourly earnings to calculate your main gender pay gap calculations. Using an hourly rate allows a better comparison between the earnings of men and women.
So now we'll look at some of the technical terms to ensure that you are aware. Snapshot date. The gender pay gap calculations will be based on figures drawn from a specific date each year. This is the snapshot date. The snapshot date is different according to the regulations which apply to your organisation. It is the 31st of March each year for those organisations covered by the public sector regulations. This includes schools, colleges and universities. And this is the 5th of April for all other employers. You will have to publish your figures within 12 months of the snapshot date. So the statutory deadline will always be the 30th of March for public bodies and the 4th of April for other employers. You can use the same methodology to report on a voluntary basis if you do not meet the employee threshold. So now we'll look at the definition of an employee. The Gender Pay Gap regulations use the same definition of an employee as the Equality Act 2010. In summary, employees are those that have a direct contract of employment with your organisation. Self-employed people will need to be included if they must personally perform the work for your organisation and you have the data available. You do not need to include data on agency workers or staff in servant companies, as they should be counted as part of the headcount of the agency or service company that provides them. Each part-time worker counts as one employee for the gender pay gap reporting purposes, and every employee within a job share counts as one employee. For employees with multiple contracts, you can choose to count them as one employee or as separate employees according to how many contracts they have. It will help the accuracy of your figures if you apply the same approach to other employees in this category too. This slide also provides the definition of relevant and full pay relevant employees, as data for two types of employee is needed for the different calculations. So, relevant employees are all employees employed on the snapshot date. And full pay relevant employees are all employees who are paid their usual full pay in their pay period that included the snapshot date. For example, this would not include employees who are on reduced pay for sick leave or maternity leave.
Turning now to ordinary pay, you need to record the amount of ordinary pay received by each full pay relevant employee for your main gender pay gap calculations. Ordinary pay includes monetary payments for staff. For example, this would include basic pay and allowances for extra responsibilities, such as teacher and learning responsibilities in schools and location-related payments. You should not include pay related to overtime, redundancy, payments or expenses. And just to flag, you need to use the gross figures before tax and any deductions for employee pension contributions, but after any deductions for any salary sacrifice schemes. You can find further guidance on this on the ACAS website. And so now looking at bonus pay, you need to collect information on any bonus pay paid to each full pay relevant employee in the pay period, which includes a snapshot date, as you will need to incorporate this into the main, mean and median calculations. You will also need to collect data on the bonuses paid to each relevant employee in the 12 months up to the snapshot date, and you'll need this for your bonus pay gap calculations. Broadly speaking, bonuses include payments related to profit performance and productivity. They do not include payments related to overtime, redundancy, or payments that do not have a monetary value.
Hourly rate. Calculating a gender pay gap using our average hourly earnings allows you to compare the earnings of men and women better. Employers need to record the hourly rate of pay for each full pay relevant employee. They can do this by recording the working hours for the pay period in which the snapshot date falls, for example, weekly, monthly, annually. Don't include pay or unpaid overtime in weekly working hours figures. adding together the ordinary pay and any bonus pay received by full pay relevant employees for the pay period, dividing the total by the appropriate multiplier for determining the weekly working hours and average hourly pay rates. For employees with irregular working hours, there is flexibility to use a 12-week average or a more suitable time period which would provide a more accurate result. So we'll now go and we'll turn to slide 16 for some examples. We have included suggested examples for teachers and term time workers in the guidance on the ACAS website. A summary of the two examples is at slide 16. Basically, you can choose to use an average for the whole year to get the fairer representation average weekly hours. So, in the first example, it's for a term time worker who works 10 hours a week. You can add her 39 work weeks and 5 annual leave weeks to make 44 paid weeks per year. Then you can multiply this by 10 hours to get 440 paid hours each year. Then you can average out the hours over the whole year, just like the payments are, by dividing her 440 paid hours by 52.18. That's the exact number of weeks in a year. This makes the average weekly hours just 8.5 hours a week. You can use this method for other full and part-time workers too. We've also included another example of minimum annualized hours. We also suggest that you view other examples on the ACAS guidance.
Okay, so having looked at how you calculate the numbers in some detail, let's turn now to understanding the reasons behind many pay gaps. So this is slide 17. Should say this is looking across the piece, so appreciate there may be different factors that are relevant to education bodies. So overall, we know that women still cluster in lower paid occupations such as caring, cashiering, catering, cleaning and clerical work. They are also underrepresented in higher paying sectors such as science, technology, engineering and finance, even though many of those growing sectors are experiencing significant skills shortages. A much higher proportion of women work part-time, and part-time workers generally earn less per hour than their full-time counterparts. And many women work part-time because they're still expected to shoulder the majority of caring responsibilities. Taking time out of the labour market because of those caring responsibilities can also impact on women's career progression. Women are less likely to occupy senior roles within an organisation. And of course, the education sector is crucial because we know that that's where we can shape the expectations for future generations. Okay, so looking now at some of the headline statistics for workforces in the education sector, this slide sets out the key statistics for schools, further education and higher education. As you can see, the overall proportions of women working in the education sector is very high, but these figures don't necessarily translate to the proportion of senior positions held by women. Tackling the gender pay gap is therefore even more relevant.
Okay, so now we'll look at a few of the big things you can do to take action to close the gap. The first one we'll look at is flexible working. And this slide sets out some of the different options for flexible working. An increasing number of teachers want to be able to work flexibly, and the majority of those are women returning from maternity leave or a career break. And this reflects a growing trend nationally across all professions. Flexible working policies help to recruit, retrain, retain and motivate teachers and staff members, provide the basis for sound financial and personal planning within schools, and minimise the risk of grievance and discrimination. Employers need to think creatively about how work is organised and think about the different potential agreements that could be made. For instance, part-time working, job sharing, compressed hours, staggered hours, and we've listed the reasons what can be done on the slide. Although regular home working may pose a bigger challenge for teachers, employers should consider options and opportunities for ad hoc working from home, including for non-contact staff members too. Slide 20. So we'll now look at recruitment and retention. Taking action in your recruitment and retention approaches will be key to closing your gender pay gap. For example, can you revise your recruitment processes to remove any gender bias? You could look at introducing gender-neutral language in job adverts, structured scoring systems, and skills-based tests. Also, if you have a gender imbalance in particular roles, look to recruit through a variety of channels and consider non-traditional sources. And also actively encourage people from all groups to apply. You could also encourage, for retention, you could also encourage the take-up of shared parental leave by promoting the policy and providing simple guidance and employee examples for your staff members. If you have a member of staff who is currently on long-term leave, maintain regular contact with staff on parental leave or career breaks and promote the use of keep in touch days. You could also put in place return programs. All these steps are very key in tackling the gender pay gap issue, but they will also tackle wider issues in the education sector.
So now turning to career progression and talent management issues. We think it's a good idea to consult your staff networks and trade unions. Clearly they will have knowledge from their members on what they think is stopping them from progressing. Also, you can encourage staff at all levels to participate in mentoring schemes and make sure you include teachers but non-teaching staff as well. And mentoring schemes can be formal or informal or like peer level schemes. You can encourage the take-up of formal and on-the-job training opportunities, but whilst doing so, make sure you consider the potential impact on part-time staff. You can ensure there is fair access to developmental opportunities and talent management pathways. Also, you can consider partnerships with other organisations to create a greater pool of training opportunities. So now looking at producing a narrative to accompany your gender pay gap figures. Although it is not mandatory to publish a narrative, we would strongly recommend that you do so. Creating a narrative will allow you to contextualise and explain your data to your own employees and relevant external bodies. We've set out some of the benefits, we think, for having a narrative. For example, you can set out the reasons, further background for any gender pay differences. You can also include any additional analysis you've undertaken to understand the underlying causes in your organisation. It provides an opportunity to explain your pay and reward policies. It also allows you to set out what action you are taking and your own commitment to closing any gaps. You can also use it to explain any existing initiatives in place which need a bit more time to take effect. Also, having a clear narrative can help you when you communicate your findings to your staff and the wider public, including unions and school governors.
Okay, so you've now set out your gender pay gap data and narrative. This slide will explore how to communicate your figures and narrative to both internal audiences and external audiences. Employers should clearly communicate with employees what is being done to tackle the issue. And you could do this by circulating proposed actions and seeking feedback, holding consultation groups with staff members, but also consult staff networks, for example, if your organisation has a women's network. Employers who view this as an opportunity to address their gender pay gap and improve workforce equality can strengthen their relationship with employees and improve retention rates. This is particularly key in the education sector. And how can you communicate your figures and narrative with external audiences? Employers should ensure their management teams and other departments, such as HR, work together to agree what action can be taken, engaging trustees and governors where appropriate. Employers should consider consulting external organisations who may have relevant expertise and insight. For example, trade unions, employer representative groups, and membership bodies. There are loads of useful resources available online, and in this slide we've just identified a few of them that we think are key. So for instance, the ACAS guidance there, we strongly recommend that you view this page. We've also listed our GPG reporting inbox here at Government Equalities Office. If you do have any further questions after this event, please contact the GPG reporting email address listed on the page.
Well, thank you very much for listening. We hope that you found some of that information helpful. We're now going to start the Q&A session. You can submit questions throughout the event, and as I said before, we'll try to get through as many as we can in the remaining time. Thank you.
Great, so moving on to the questions and answers. Firstly, we just wanted to say sorry. We can see that some of you are experiencing some technical issues and we're trying to resolve them as we go through the event. Please keep your questions coming through and we'll get through as many as we can. So firstly, let's go to it's a question about what happens if your organisation has merged or closed and now has less than 250 employees. For this, organisations in this category, if you had 250 or more employees on the 31st of March 2017, you are still required to report your gender pay gap data. Academy trusts that have merged since March 2017 are required to publish their calculations as they existed on the snapshot date of 31st of March 2017. You will need to seek your own advice, however, about whether the newly merged trust is subject to the duty to report gender pay gap information on staff employed by the predecessor organisations, as this will depend on the terms of the merger. As a general rule, if an organisation did not exist on the snapshot date, it will not be subject to the duty. Organisations that are no longer operating will still be in the process of winding up, and gender pay gap data need to be reported as part of that. You can explain any structural changes to your organisation this financial year as part of your accompanying narrative. Okay, so moving on, we've had a couple of questions about universities in Scotland and whether the requirements apply to them. Universities in Scotland are not covered by the gender pay gap regulations and do not need to upload the data to the online reporting service. Higher education institutions in Scotland will need to follow the requirements set out in the Scottish specific duties regulations which underpin the public sector equality duty. The Scottish regulations require public bodies with 20 or more employees to publish information on the percentage difference in average hourly pay, excluding overtime, between male and female employees. Whether or not the university has a charitable status does not have an impact. And also just to say that this is also the case for public sector education bodies in Wales who will need to follow the Welsh specific duties regulations. Okay, there's a question about, will the GEO be compiling national, regional gender pay gap averages for the FE sector so we can benchmark ourselves? The annual survey of hours and earnings published by the Office for National Statistics provides the national gender pay gap figures for different sectors. And as we covered in the slides earlier, this is broken down for the different parts of the education sector. And the estimate for the further education sector was 15.6 in October 2017. This survey is annual, so the data will be refreshed later this year. Sorry about that. So we've got a few questions also about casual staff, including exam invigilators. And I mean, the key thing here is if they are employed on the snapshot date, they should be counted as a full pay relevant employee and included in your overall mean and median pay gap calculations. A casual member of staff who is not employed for a pay period, which includes the 31st of March snapshot date, will not be counted as a full pay relevant employee. So an exam invigilator who is only employed for a week in June would not need to be included in your head count or calculations. And also a question about, do we need to include agency workers in the gender pay gap calculations? No, generally speaking, agency workers or staff in service companies count as part of the head count of the agency or service company that provides them. But temporary staff that are directly employed by you and have a contract with your organisation need to be included in your reported data. And then moving on, can the actual hourly rate be used for casual staff? You can use the actual hourly rate if the employee is paid a fixed hourly rate with no allowances or bonuses, or you can use the actual hours worked to calculate the hourly rate, but make sure you exclude any overtime. Another question about, this is a question about staff who have a regular contract but also may take on casual work on top of this. And then in this situation, you can either choose to count them according to how many employment contracts they have or count them as one employee. So really the flexibility is there and you can choose the most appropriate approach, but it will help the accuracy of your figures if you consistently apply what you decide.
So we've had a question come in regarding multi-academy trusts. As a multi-academy trust, do I have to do the overall figures or can I break them down and report them school by school? So the answer to this, a multi-academy trust is a single legal entity and employer. Therefore, you would need to provide combined figures for all the academies in that chain together with non-academic staff when you publish your figures. However, you can choose to include a school-by-school breakdown in your supporting narrative. And we've had another question related to multi-academy trusts. We've 2 schools in our multi-academy trust with 2 different payroll providers. So I will need advice on how to merge the data. So I appreciate this is quite a tricky one. Essentially, you will need to ensure that different payroll providers have given you equivalent data on both sets of employees to ensure that the calculations are accurate. The GEO and ACAS guidance, which we include in slide 24 of this webinar, provides a list of the essential information you will need to produce the different calculations. So it is worth asking them for confirmation that they are using the same approach. Also, you should check with them that they have used a consistent approach towards allowances and bonuses so that your figures are directly comparable.
Okay, so we've had a question about bonus pay. The question is, should bonus pay be added to the annualised salary to work out the hourly rate, regardless of when the bonus was paid? Or do bonuses only count for the hourly rate if they were paid in the pay period, i.e. during March 2017? Yes, so bonus payments are only added to the ordinary pay calculations, and that's for the mean and median gender pay gap calculations, if the payment is received during the relevant pay period, which includes the snapshot date. If the bonus payment was paid in another time period, which does not include the snapshot date, it would not be added to the ordinary pay calculations, but of course would still be captured in the 12-month bonus period. If you are working out the bonus payment, which comes within the ordinary pay calculations, you need to think about whether to prorate the amount. So if the period for which a bonus was received is the same as the relevant pay period, the full amount should be recorded. If the period for which a bonus was received differs to or exceeds the pay period, the bonus amount should be prorated, so divided by the number of days in the bonus period and then multiplied by the number of days in the pay period. If a bonus is not related to a time period, the full amount should be included. Also connected to that, there's a question about honorarium payments to staff at the top of their pay range whose performance is exceptional. These are discretionary.
So do they count as bonuses?
Yeah. Yes, they do count as bonuses.
And Jisha, there was a question elsewhere on TLRs and whether they count as pay or bonuses.
Sorry. Go down. There it is. Additional teaching learning responsibilities. They might be allowances or bonuses. Additional teaching learning responsibilities could potentially be allowances or bonuses, and you'll just need to make a decision based on whether they're being paid for additional duties or whether they're something to reward exceptional performance. And just be consistent in all your calculations.
So we've had a question come in, how much detail should we report as part of our narrative? This is completely up to you. Although we strongly recommend to develop and publish a narrative, it is not mandatory. We recommend that you thinking about what information will be useful to explain your figures and how you are planning to reduce any gaps in your organisation. It is worth asking others for their views if you are unsure. For example, think about involving staff networks or colleagues in other teams.
We've had a question about how to report on quartiles, which asks whether it should show the proportion of males and females across the 4 quartiles, or whether they should be reported as a proportion of males and females in each quartile. The second of those, I think, is correct. So you look at each quartile and see how many men and women are in quartile 1, this is the top quartile, for example, and then for the second quartile, a breakdown between male and female.
we'll have another look at the ACAS guidance, but I'm not sure that it is wrong on that point, but we'll have another look at it.
Yes, so there's a question about, as the data itself is not submitted, how will the government be able to judge the accuracy of the results that people are publishing? So yes, the Government Equalities Office is not a regulator, and we are not in a position to verify the accuracy of individual employers' data. The Equality and Human Rights Commission has the power to take enforcement action against employers that breach the regulations. So we are trying to look at whether some data looks statistically unlikely, and trying to alert employers to maybe look at their figures again. We recognise, however, that in some cases it is possible that data which may be statistically unlikely is nevertheless accurate. Yes. Next question.
So we've had a question come in. Could you please clarify what to do if a school joined a multi-academy trust since the snapshot date? For example, one school joined the existing multi-academy trust on the 1st of November, when the snapshot date is the 31st of March. So organisations that had 250 or more employees on the relevant snapshot date are required to report their gender pay gap under the regulations, even if they now have fewer than 250 employees. Academy trusts that have merged since March 2017 are required to publish their calculations as they existed on the snapshot date of the 31st of March 2017. But we would advise you to seek advice about whether the newly merged trust is subject to the duty to report the gender pay gap information on staff employment by the predecessor organisation, as this will depend on the terms of the merger. As a general rule, if an organisation did not exist on the snapshot date, it will not be subject to the duty. Organisations that are no longer operating will still be in the process of winding up, and gender pay gap data needs to be reported as part of that. You can explain any structural changes to your organisation this financial year as part of your accompanying narrative.
Can I just add to that, just to answer the question very specifically? The existing multi-academy trust would need to report its figures as they stood on the 31st of March, so not including any staff that joined when a school joined the multi-academy trust later. Just look at what the position was on the 31st of March 2017.
Okay, I'm just going to look at a question about teachers' terms and conditions. The question saying this is causing an issue with guidance from ACAS suggesting full-time hours are 32.5, but with support staff contracted for 37 hours. This is causing significant variance against recalculated figures at 37 hours per week across the board. Realistically, teachers work more than their directed time, so how do we get over this? What we would suggest is if support staff work on a term time basis, you should also work out their averages over the year. And we covered this a bit in the presentation, but also this is covered in the joint GEO ACAS guidance. And we think this would provide a more comparable rate against the hourly rate for teachers. And also just talking generally about teachers, we think that using contractual hours is the most appropriate way of showing the gender pay differences in an organisation, and it's not really feasible for employers to calculate the hours worked for each employee.
So we've just had a question in about the snapshot date for multi-academy trusts. And the question states that they've had conflicting dates for multi-academy trusts, some which are planning to report on the 5th of April. So to confirm, the snapshot date for multi-academy trusts will be the 31st of March, every year, and the data will need to be recorded on the 30th of March every year. So multi-academy trusts are part of the public sector regulations, therefore the snapshot date is the 31st of March every year, and the recording and reporting date will be the 30th of March every year.
Okay, there was a question about penalties and enforcement of the regulations. Essentially, employers who fail to report on time will be in breach of the regulations and risk facing legal action from the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and ultimately this could lead to court orders and fines.
So we just had a question in. I work for an independent specialist college with more than 250 employees. Our parent body is a charity. How does this affect how we report? So for that, further and higher education organisations, so the public sector ones, the public sector regulations apply to further and higher education bodies defined at section 91 of the Further and Higher Education Act. So this includes sixth form colleges, institutions conducted by further education corporations, all universities in England, and universities that are regulated by institutions. Further and higher educations that are not covered by the definitions at section 91 will need to follow the gender pay gap requirements for the private and voluntary sector employees.
Okay.
Just to add in, there's been a couple of questions both for universities and multi-academy trusts around does anything change if your organisation also has charitable status? Lots of educational bodies have charitable status. Just to be clear, you are covered by the public sector reporting regulations, and therefore, as Edward said earlier, those deadlines apply. Of course, in reality, all sectors are being asked to submit the same basic data. It's just the deadline and the snapshot date that is different.
Okay, there were a few questions asked about the figures that we used in the slides. We only quoted the median figures when we were talking about the gender pay gap for the UK and for the different parts of the education sector. We tend to use the median figures for comparisons because it's the midpoint of earnings, and it best represents the typical difference in gender pay gap, as it is unaffected by a small number of very high earnings. There's also a question about is it compulsory to submit hourly rate? We have done an annual salary mean and median gap. Yes, I'm afraid it is compulsory to use the hourly rate. This is specified in the regulations, so if you use annual salaries, you will not be complying with the calculations as set out in the regulations.
Just there was a general question about what resources do we particularly recommend for clear, relatively simple definitions and how-to guidance on calculations. Would that be, which resources and guidance would we be recommending for that?
Yes, I think that the regulations themselves go into a fair bit of detail in terms of what is required, what needs to, how you do the calculations. To kind of complement that, the guidance that the Government Equalities Office developed with ACAS has kind of step-by-step instructions on what you need to do to include in your calculations, but also more general advice on what you can think about for your narrative. In addition to this, there's also the Government Equalities Office has a campaign page which pulls together resources, links to resources, and also kind of insights from employers, and the viewing service itself. It's a great way to see kind of what other organisations' data looks like, but also you can access links to their narratives. So I think the kind of amalgamation of all that material should be really helpful. Sorry, just looking at more questions.
Sorry, there was another question from a multi-academy trust again, asking if their employee numbers go over 250 only after the snapshot date, do they need to report? And the answer is no, you don't. You don't have to. You're not obliged to by regulations. If you've been getting communications from us, you can follow the instructions in the letter in order to kind of take yourself off the list, as it were. Equally, though, a couple of people have asked, is it possible to voluntarily report, even if you're not actually within scope of reporting because of the size of your organisation? And the answer to that is absolutely yes. And I think various organisations might choose to report voluntarily to show their commitment to addressing the issues that the gender pay gap reporting is designed to highlight. So, yeah, great if you can consider that. There's some, Edward, perhaps while we're just checking other questions, lots of questions about asking for copies of the slides and so on. Can you just recap where both the slides and this webinar can be accessed?
Yeah, so hopefully all attendees should have received the invitation and reminder emails. So there'll be a copy of the slides contained in a link in their reminder emails. We also plan to email the slides out on the whole webinar again after this session. The StreamGo, which is the company delivering the webinar, will also host it on their website, and the Government Equalities Office will also post a link to the webinar, so the PowerPoint and the question and answer session, on our social media channels, so Facebook and YouTube, and we can send you the links around as well. We've also got the Government Equalities Office email address, which is contained in the PowerPoint presentation pack, but I'll just read it out now. So it's gpg.reporting@geo.gov.uk. So gpg.reporting@geo.gov.uk. If you do have any further questions, if you'd like to email us, if you've got any queries, if you're having any technical problems with reporting, let us know and we'll try and get back to you on that.
Okay, there's a question about job share and whether these are counted as 1 or 2 employees. They would be counted as 2 employees on separate contracts, so you need to work out the hourly rate for each job share partner. Also, there was quite an interesting question about midday assistance and how this can really dramatically affect the gender pay gap in schools, and despite doing a lot of work to try and encourage more male applicants, it's still predominantly female. This is a very tricky one. I think if you as an organisation is doing everything you can to get a more diverse field of candidates, then really this is about using the narrative to explain how this has impacted on the gender pay gap in your organisation, and also setting out the fact that you are taking steps to address that. And I think this is why the narrative is so important. We're not saying that that there will be different reasons for a pay gap. It's about kind of what action you want to take and how you explain it. Okay, have we got time for another
Questions around term time working, Jish?
Oh, sorry, I thought we covered that. Yeah, so with term time workers, we appreciate that if you use the actual hours worked over the pay period, this wouldn't provide an accurate figure, particularly if there are any school closures or holidays. So instead, you can choose to use a number which fairly represents the hours worked in a week and average out the contractual hours over the whole year. We went through this earlier in the presentation, but also we do have some suggested examples for term time workers in the GEO ACAS guidance.
And that applies including for staff who might work part-time, work term time, but are paid evenly and equally through the year with 12 instalments. So
yes.
It's the same basic approach.
Yes, that's correct. This is about trying to get an accurate hourly rate for those staff.
And we've just had another question in on teacher and learning responsibilities in schools. So just to clarify, teacher and learning responsibilities is considered part of ordinary pay. So ordinary pay would include teacher and learning responsibilities.
A question about the 250 employee threshold that creates the scope for mandatory reporting. Is it based on the number of staff paid in the snapshot period? It's not the period. It's on the snapshot day, presumably.
Yes, that's correct. It's the number of employees employed on the 31st of March every year. But please bear in mind that will cover temporary staff or contractors that have a direct contract of employment. It's not just people on your payroll. Okay.
Yeah, so we're just about to wrap it up for today. What we'll do, if there's any unanswered questions that we still have, we know who sent them in, so what we'll do is we'll try and email everybody back out for the questions we haven't managed to cover. So thank you guys for joining our webinar today. We hope you found it useful. As I've said previously, we will be sending out the slides to via email. They'll be on our social media channels, and we have also previously sent them out. So we hope you found it useful today. Any questions that we haven't covered, we will try and get back to you because we have your email addresses. So thank you guys.
Yeah, and I hope that you will kind of look at the resources that we flagged. Also, just to say, if you are in scope and you haven't registered yet, please register with the online reporting service as soon as possible to avoid any technical delays, but also because you'll get access to newsletters and support. Thank you very much.
Thank you.